Hello, everyone. This is Luke Johnson from Noetic, the humanities teaching platform, which you can beta test at noetic.online right now. I'm back with Robert Schut to discuss Soren Kierkegaard's My Point of View as an author. Did I get the whole title right? It's a long title.
Oh, it's a little bit more, and then it's colon a report to history.
Yeah. What's the whole proper title? I'm
Okay, it's the point of view for my work as an author, colon a report to history.
Yes, that's right. My book is in the basement. So this is our second installment of it. Bob will be our instructor today. I'm excited to talk about this. Bob, where are we picking up today?
Well, we're picking up on lesson 3. We established last week that Kierkegaard is discussing with us the idea of being an aesthetic writer and being a religious writer. And which of the two is he? Is he both? Was he an aesthetic writer who became a religious writer? And he's kind of giving us the answer here, as we'll see. But this relates to Christendom, and kind of very interesting, the two phases of Christendom, if we can call them phases or stages or whatever, where we take an aesthetic stage or the explanation of Christianity and a religious stage of Christianity. And I think that'll come clear to us as we discuss that between ourselves a little bit more. We'll spend a little time on that. So in lesson 3, he starts us out telling us the illusion that religion can give us is that it's something that we can put off until we get older.
Right.
Okay. And that youth doesn't recognize the seriousness of the age or the seriousness of eternity. The youth, as we were youthful at one time, right, Luke? The youth are drawn in.
I'm not dead yet, Bob. I'm 37. Do you recall that scene from Monty Python? Where's that?
No,
old woman, can you tell me how to get to Camelot or whatever? He's like, I'm not old. I'm 37. And I'm a man. My name's Dennis.
Yeah. It says that the youth are drawn into the aesthetic lifestyle and are suspicious of the religious person. And I'm thinking, is this rightfully so? It appears that it is. It appears that many of the youth are suspicious about older religious people. But it used to be that the elderly were looked up to as being wise in the old civilizations, especially when it came to religion. Do we really see this today anymore? I kind of ask. So I thought I'd just quickly ask you, Luke, do you see in your environment, in your lifestyle out there on the East Coast, that the elderly are still held up to a respectful level of knowledge, or do you think that that's just kind of disappeared from our society?
No, I think there is great discrimination against the elderly. I do whatever. I'm not gonna. I guess I'm not really gonna hide. It's a conspiracy, right? There's a program within work of our society to make people past a certain age look senile, to look dumb, to look out of it, to look like they suffer from Alzheimer's or something like that. It's to create a stereotype. I guess the expression is ageist. So if you can write off anyone, I guess, who's beyond retirement, like 66 or whatever the age is for retirement these days, you don't have to listen to them. They're just an old fuddy-duddy that has nothing important to say. So I think our culture has become radically autonomous in that way and is not deferential to our elders at all. I think it's a big problem. And, I think it's also unfortunate that I think, maybe some people who are of that age, not you, definitely not you, have, I guess, embraced the lack of responsibility for bringing up the young, like that they don't have that responsibility to pass on wisdom from past ages or whatever. And so have gladly handed it over to experts or something like that. But to be honest, I've always appreciated the deference to ancestors that are in sort of Native American traditions and stuff like that. It seems to be still alive and well there. But at least in modern American culture, I mean, through TV and movies, I mean, old people are made to look like they've lost their minds. And I just think it's a tragedy.
Well, I wonder if it's an influence of technology, because in technology, anything that's old is bad, and anything that's brand new is the greatest thing that's ever happened. And I wonder if we kind of visit that on people, because it's kind of like a way of life, a mode of life. We learn the new is the better, not the old.
Right. You always want the brand new model, the newest iPhone and this and that. I think that definitely plays into it. I think there's been this great idea too that like that truth is not historical, right? That anything worth knowing is not really embedded in history as well, right? That
True.
That people who live through certain epochs in history have nothing really to communicate to us about our present age. So we don't have to listen to people who live through certain wars or whatever. And guess what happens when we don't listen? We go and get ourselves in new wars.
Yeah. Now he says, but what he says here is that there's a tendency of older people to take refuge in religion. So one might say that the aesthetic belongs to the young and the religious to the old, if we were going to kind of split them up by age group. And I kind of asked why this is so. Is it because that the youth crave the things of the flesh more strongly than the elderly? I don't even want to say elderly, just that the older, maybe more mature, and that it overcomes the desire for holiness. Is it because the young search for fun and pleasure, or more pleasure seeking, but the old start to get more serious about life because they get closer to the end, and they might be more willing to seek for a life of holiness?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. I think like the younger you are, the more married you are to your primordial instincts. So you're going to be doing a lot more thinking with your hormones than with your neurons. So there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, just biologically, I think young people aren't as rational as, say, older people are. And I think in my very biased view, the more rational you are, you ought to really become more religious. But there are many rational atheists out there that would disagree with me on that. But the other thing too is that the society is in such a way that it preaches a forever young mentality, or that it's better to die young than to fade away. What's the Neil Young song, right? It's better to burn out than to fade away. Was he the one who wrote that song? There's this whole idea that like when we're young, we're gods and goddesses and the world is ours and we can do anything and chasing dreams and, you know, be like Jim Morrison and Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix and like do everything that you're going to do in your life before you're 27. And then, maybe you'll overdose and that was a good life. That trope is communicated to a lot of young people.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that too, I guess, plays against the idea of being deferential to the elders.
So now we kind of opened up by discussing what the aesthetic and the religious are apart from one another, but now he says we're going to try to look at them side by side, parallel to one another. And he says that they can exist simultaneously. So usually you go from one stage to the next, but he's going to say, but wait a second, these stages can go on together simultaneously. People can have thoughts of Christianity and even agree with the theology and the ideology of Christianity. They may think that Jesus loved us and died for us, and etc. All the good Christian ideals. They might accept the entire theological program, but at the same time, they defer total commitment until they become older. And he asks, does this make them like the heathen? Does God's forgiveness become something that we try to exploit, like in Romans? I'm not sure if you're familiar with this verse. It says in Romans 6:1, it says, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? So is that kind of how we live our lives today? That we think that grace is what we're looking for from God, and the more sin that we have, the more grace it takes. So we're just bringing out God's grace. I know it sounds maybe kind of silly, but there are people I've met who actually think that way. So Paul really wasn't speaking merely to the first, second century church. Now, go
Yeah,
ahead. You're going to say something.
something that I struggle with, right, is, I take that verse very seriously. The question then becomes, and you see it a lot with Puritan theologians, is the emphasis of the mortification of the desires, right? That they sort of could acknowledge this, the sinful proclivities within us, and then, right, how much do you suppress it? How much do you separate from the carnal world? And does Christianity become really what the topic of the discussion is today? Does, in its extreme form, can Christianity become this sort of suppressive, mortifying religion? And then ought it to, right? Like, of course it can, but it's an interesting theological question about ought it to. Like, I mean, you have all these examples of religious people. I mean, Kierkegaard himself, think about what Kierkegaard deprived himself of.
Yeah.
Right? He deprived himself of marriage. He deprived himself of, obviously sex. He deprived himself of friendship. He deprived himself of enjoying the opera for more than 5 or 10 minutes. There was always this impulse within him to constantly be serving the Lord through his work. And it was, and we talked about last week how it took great tolls on his health.
Yeah.
I can relate to this.
Now, do you know, I don't know how much you know about Constantine, but Constantine waited until his deathbed before he was baptized for fear that he would commit sin after baptism. And the question was, in his particular situation, I'd have to ask the question, is killing your wife by drowning because it was reported she committed adultery with her son-in-law, her stepson rather, a sin? Because that's what she was accused of. See, history kind of records that Constantine had his wife murdered, or perhaps even did it himself, drowned in a bathtub because she was committing adultery with her stepson, as reported anyway. So Constantine led a kind of interesting, I guess we can use that word, life. But the whole idea of Constantine was that he postponed baptism until his deathbed, because he was afraid that if he was baptized and then he committed a sin, he wouldn't be forgiven for it. So he just kept putting it off until the very end.
And he thought if he had gotten baptized and been a serious Christian, then he wouldn't have been able to rule, right?
And that's exactly right. Yes.
Yeah, he couldn't carry on his conquests and whatnot.
Couldn't do what a king is supposed to do, or an emperor. So if one could remain young, there would be no. Is this then the divine purpose of death, perhaps, to make us aware of our need for religion? So is this why when we get older and we become more aware of death, we become more concerned about life? Without death, we would just continue on in that aesthetic world.
Right. We would be kind of like Olympian gods, right? And we would get into petty fights and squabbles and have battles over the Mount Olympus or whatever. But yeah, that does raise an interesting question, right? Like presumably angels have some form of immortality, right? But then we see that even that comfort in immortality led to the fall, right? Lucifer was the anointed cherubim, and he fell. Immortality is a very interesting question. Like, I mean, if we do really take this whole idea of Christianity very seriously, and we are saved and we are experience the beatific vision with Jesus and God one day, I mean, we too will be immortal. Will we cease to be religious when we have that immortality conferred upon us? I don't think we would. I think we'll be in that heavenly choir. I think we'll be very excited about it.
I think so.
Yeah, because it seems like the realm that I guess just to complete the thought, it seems like what matters is the realm the immortality is applied to. If the immortality is applied to this realm of earth, then it can make people less religious. But if the immortality is applied to subjects that are in heaven, then there's a chance that it makes them more religious. So,
well, yeah, matter of fact, in Paul in Romans tells us that the bodies that we have now are made and designed for the temporal world, for mortality. Yeah,
they're made to decay.
But the bodies that we will have will be designed for eternity, and they'll be immortal bodies. So I think a lot has to do with the vessel that we bear at the time. When we bear an eternal vessel, we won't have to worry about sin the way we do now. They won't be subject to the same kind of temptations.
Well, when we have eternal vessels, I mean, presumably we'll be able to come face to face with God. It's pretty hard to sin against God if you can look at him. You know,
Yeah.
we can't really do that right now.
Yeah, yeah. He says that we have a sense of growing older in time, but not in eternity. This means that we have no clue about the idea of eternity and how long it will last. It's kind of hard for us to really discuss eternity or perceive it. We could talk about it and so forth, but really, how much do we understand about eternity? We really don't. It's just kind of a projection of eternity for us. I think is a projection of the temporal into the future.
I like to think about it as like endless perfection.
Mm-hmm.
Does that help at all to think of it that way?
Yeah, it does. It gives a different depth of our idea of eternity. Instead of just time, what you're doing is you're bringing in the idea of depth, of character, which is not usually brought into it. So that's very good. Thank you. Do we really take hell serious if we believed we would be there for eternity? The implication here is that we would have no spiritual sense of our reality. So if we did believe in the biblical principles that there was a hell, that hell would also be for eternity, that might have an influence on our behavior, on our character, and how seriously we take life.
You think?
I think so.
I mean, just think about it from a corporeal sort of perspective, right? From a temporal perspective, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm not advocating the death penalty, okay? But this is just a thought experiment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if there's no death penalty, right? So we have world A where there's a death penalty, right? And that death penalty is like swiftly applied, right? So the second that you kill someone, then you are annihilated as well, right? Mm-hmm. That's world A. And then world B, there's no death penalty. There's just rehabilitation or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Which world is going to be the world with less crime?
Yeah.
The world where, like that if you knew the second that you took someone else's life, there would be retribution visited upon you, right? Yeah. Now, if we were to expand that to the idea of retribution being applied to you for eternity, I think we would behave ourselves a little better.
And no matter how you view hell, even if we take away the flames and all that out of the picture, because those are just pictures for us anyway. If we just consider it a miserable place, just think of
God. Of God.
But just think, whatever it is for eternity. I mean, even if you had a thorn in your finger, if you had to have that thorn in your finger for eternity, that's just not the way I want to live in eternity, Well,
if we're thinking about heaven as being a place of eternal perfection, then hell would be a place of eternal corruption.
Yeah. So just the people you'd be with should be convincing enough.
Yeah. If you need a refresher on that, check out our lesson on Sartre's No Exit.
Yes. So he continues to say, sometimes the religious elderly are very stern and fault-finding of the young. We talked about this just a little minute ago. This would turn off the youth into thinking that they also have to conform to that type of personality if they want to please God. Sometimes God is brought across like that no, God is, he's holding the hammer or the sword or the sickle or something, and you get out of line and, that's it, that you're done for. That's not how God operates. But if he's projected like that by the elderly, the youth are going to say, I don't want to worship a God like that. I don't want to worship a God that's going to be so fault-finding and just constantly punishing me for anything that I do. And that's sometimes unfortunate that some people do have that idea of God. They've yet to really experience his grace and his forgiveness. And he tells us that the aesthetic works are only a means of communication, his works. So Kierkegaard kind of jumps in and out of thoughts here. He kind of goes and he develops that one thought. Now he's jumping out of that a little bit and saying that, you know, the aesthetic works that I've written are a means of communication. We'll find out that this is a kind of way of preparing his audience for the Christian paradox, which is Christ. So he's kind of trying to stay several steps ahead of the reader. And he analyzes the reader and he says, my readers in Denmark, anyway, at this time, is going to be aesthetic. And so how do I get them from the aesthetic to the religious? I have to kind of manipulate them. So I have to first start out at the aesthetic level to get their attention. We'll talk about this as we're going through. He says that his concern is that people won't believe in his method. They won't come to the religious through the aesthetic. So this is kind of like an untested method he's using here. And if that's true, then everything he's doing, he says, is a colossal waste of time and his life if this isn't going to work. So this is his test. This is his what would we call it? Experiment.
Right.
Right.
And it's his cross to bear. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is his experiment. If this doesn't work, his whole life is a waste of time. But this is always the risk of faith. Faith always has that element of risk to it. We can never really judge ourselves in this way. And even Kierkegaard, look at Kierkegaard himself. His work didn't become recognized until after his death. So maybe he didn't even know really whether his method here worked or not before he died.
I think he had some sense that it was working. I mean, I think in this book, he does refer to the fact that he does have something at this stage in his life, that something that approximates a public. I think he was starting to see it anticipated where things are now, but I think he was starting to anticipate that he had a readership, Yeah, I think he knew he was getting through to some people.
So, but his books weren't flying off the shelf, right?
Oh, no. He's much more popular now than he ever was then.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the point I think we need to make, that back in his day, he might have known that he got to a few, but not as many, hopefully, as he's influenced since his death. And more so now. I think more people are coming to him as they're getting more and more frustrated with the way that philosophy has taken them today. So what if we tried to save some time, he says, and if we tried to go directly to the religious? What if we didn't bring people first to the aesthetic and go directly to the religious? Such a communicator, he says, is over anxious and to be regarded as religious. One might want to speed up the process so that everyone will know that he's religious. So the true religious man is patient and knows that he needs to first prepare the believer in order to remove his deception. So, in his words, a teacher may be able to pass on his instruction and his knowledge to the student, but the teacher, caught up in his reputation, instead of teaching to a particular lesson and exclaiming that he didn't really understand it, being honest with the student, would never do such a thing, because others would find out that he was not fit to become a teacher. So I think what he's saying here, Luke, is that it comes down to ego. The teacher is more caught up with the idea, I'm a teacher, and I'm supposed to know everything, so I can't admit to the pupils, to the students, that I don't know that. So if they ask a question, he's always got an answer, as clever as it might be, but may not be truthful. Because above everything else, it's not to preserve truth, it's to preserve his reputation. So the person who has a religious character, or even a person who's in pursuit of it, cannot endure being regarded as the only person who's not religious. He must be considered by others to be religious. So now he's giving us a false sense of religious. In other words, not the good religious,
Right.
but those people who are falsely religious. They see themselves as the most important thing is not that I am religious, is but that you know it. So I have to.
Right. They've made an idol of themselves, and I think what we find out about is like pretty much you investigate, at least in modern culture, if you investigate any of these people that set themselves up as idols of religiousness, they're almost all of them are frauds.
Yeah, at some level, I think that they are. Even though some of them, I'll just say, some of them have done good and accomplished good, it's not necessarily to their credit. I always credit God.
God can still use them. God can still use them, but I mean, geez, Louise, I was watching something on these televangelists who have. I'm not going to name any names because I don't know what the legal issues are. But I was watching this documentary on like these televangelists that have like their own planes and like $18 million mansions and.
Yeah,
get out of here! Get out of here! You know who I'm talking about, and I mean, I wanted to pull my hair out.
Yeah. There's a category of them that fit that description. More than one. Even if you can't get some. Oh, this is a lesson 4 now. If you're following at home in your books, lesson 4. Even if you can't get someone to follow you, you can at least get them to notice you, which is kind of an interesting way of looking at it. And then I have kind of like my own little questions here. Can you or me really turn a person into a Christian? And the best we can do, I think, is to get the person to take notice of our witness of Christ. The best testimony, however, is not the testimony about the miracles that happened in our lives. Well, I've seen Jesus. I've had these discussions with Christ. I've seen visions. God has done this and that for me. These really aren't the best kind of testimonies, but rather the best testimony is about our character and how God has shaped us and changed us. How God has made me wealthy and famous is not a testimony of the power of Christ, but how he changed my character, making more humble, more innocent, more forgiving, more loving, and even more generous. That is a testimony of my character. And I don't think we should lose track of that. We need to show how God has accomplished his grace in our character or in our spirit, not always by healing us or physically giving us great miracles. The physical healing is important, but it's only a sign of what is possible for us inwardly. The outward bodily healing is just something done to show God can heal. So if I can heal your body, can you imagine what I could do to your soul and your spirit? And we've lost track of that. We've kind of focused just on the external healing. But all that is only a sign of what God can do internally. The body will only last for a small period of time, but the spirit and the soul last forever. So, onward.
I would say this. I do think individuals like you and me and Kierkegaard, a Christian position, an intellectual option for individuals. They're doing what we're doing. I think people could write off Christianity wholesale as being full of hucksters and holy rollers and kind of devoid of real thinking men.
Yeah, and hopefully that we're doing something to alter that opinion, to let people know there really is a true Christianity.
Yeah.
Still. Sometimes when we try to, he says that sometimes when we try to compel someone to believe, we wind up making them bitter towards us and towards our cause. But they do take notice of our character by our genuine martyrdom. He says that one of the biggest problems with pastors or preachers in Christendom, which is the false Christianity or the imitation of it, is that they live under this illusion and they're looking for adherents for the sake of increasing their wealth or size of their congregation. They're not even careful if these are true believers or not. And we were just saying that in our own words. Kierkegaard noticed.
They don't care. They don't care.
My own complaint is that there are so many who want to lead people to Christ, but few who want to teach them the deeper things about their faith. It's kind of like get them in the door, get them to confess. Now they're Christians. Now I'm moving on to the next batch of newbies. And there's something that's been missing for my entire life, Luke, in that growth process of, okay, now that I'm a Christian, who do I go? Where do I get growth? And nobody could, even self-admittingly, well, we're not here for that. All we're here for is to bring people into the church. So regarding the teaching of the priesthood of Melchizedek, a very interesting character. Someday we'll get a chance to talk about him.
You taught me about him.
Somewhat, a little bit at a time.
Yeah, no. You were the very first person to introduce this character of Melchizedek into my life, and it really expanded my mind. That's like, I think that was a real mind expanding moment when you told me about him.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's always good to know that I've had an effect on somebody.
But also, for the record, I'm insane. So
yeah.
You might have started this this current state of sustained insanity.
Oh, okay. Well, even though we take that character that we talked about there, and we find him in Hebrews, the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, he says that the teachers need teachers because they're still babes in their thinking. They've not grown beyond the very basics of becoming a Christian. Now, for people who say, Bob, you're getting way out, keep yourself limited to Scripture, I'm going to read a scripture from Hebrews that discusses this issue. That is there something beyond just saying, I accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior? Is there something beyond that? Well, Hebrews says, yes, there is. He says in chapter 6, verses 1 through 3 of the American Standard Version, he says, wherefore, leaving the doctrine of the first principles of Christ, let us press on unto perfection, not laying again a foundation of repentance from dead works and of faith towards God, of the preaching of baptisms, and the laying on of hands, and of resurrection of the dead, and of eternal judgment. And this we will do if God permit. So even the author of Hebrew scolded the people of his community, saying, okay, you guys are saved, move on. Head towards perfection. That's your job. And so just to let you know that I'm still in context here with the scriptures. So Kierkegaard continues. He calls this vain conceit and says that they are in purely aesthetic categories. They use aesthetic works to captivate their audience. And I, in parentheses, put sounds, lights, mannerisms, gesticulations. These are all part of the aesthetic world. But now, what do they do with all those who have accepted the aesthetic version of Christ? So once you've brought people into this aesthetic world of Christianity, what do you do with them? There are many in Christendom, he says, who try to assure themselves that they are Christians. There is a confusion here in that they already are Christians, rather than that they believe themselves to be Christians. How then can you convert or reconvert a Christian to Christianity? So what he's saying here is, how do we approach the Christians from Christendom, meaning those people who have maybe given a little piece of the gospel and have now believed they're Christians, but maybe not necessarily are? How do we approach them directly, since they do not think that they are not Christians, in his words? So these people are convinced that I was born, I was baptized as an infant, and I'm a Christian, so I don't need to worry about anything anymore. My character doesn't matter. My behavior doesn't matter. I know I have this diploma, well, not a diploma, this certificate of baptism, and it says I've been baptized into the body of Christ. So why do I need to do anything else?
Well, let's play a little ping pong here. I want, because this could open up a deep theological, philosophical conversation, and you've thought about it, and I just want you to weigh in on it for a second, okay?
Yes.
I can understand from Kierkegaard's perspective, from what I understand of his general corpus, the reason why he would want an intensification of what we're calling, business, right? To go deeper than just getting in the door, getting the diploma, getting baptized, or whatever else, is that so in general, there is there is something more serious about Christendom that can, to the outsider, but also for what it can do for the inner life of the individual, so that they're not just still trapped in aesthetic categories, that they have recourse to religious resources and spiritual development that will better help them deal with existential anxiety and angst and things of that nature. But this raises a very interesting question about salvation and even what salvation means, right? So these Christians, these aesthetic Christians who, got their diploma, did their little dunk in the tank or whatever, right?
Yeah.
They went and saw a really cool light show and a bunch of dreamy hunks singing about with their rock band, right? Kierkegaard's not going to want to say that those individuals are not saved. I mean, and if he is, how can we possibly have that sort of internal scrutiny? And then, is there any question of becoming more or less saved in this existential development? Or is it really just about how we can better live out the Christian ideal and be more at one with our eternal abode and not so much in temporal categories? You understand what I'm trying to say here?
Yes.
Is like Kierkegaard's not trying to say that those individuals aren't saved, or is he? What do you think?
I don't think he wants to mess with that question, because first of all, if he does, he's going to turn the people off. And you know him, he doesn't want to do that. He wants to get the reader to read on, to read forward. If he
sometimes he wants to turn them off. Sometimes he wants to offend them, right? He oscillates between.
He plays with them. He plays with them. Yeah. But I think if he played that would be like a game killer if he started to talk about that. The way I look at it, Luke, is that lately I can say, let's split it into two groups. Let's split it, the aesthetic believer and the religious believer. And excuse me, whether or not, and I think it does, translates to those who are called and those who are chosen, which is more of a biblical response.
Go on. Give me more.
Okay. God calls many, as Jesus said, which has always been a very difficult verse for me to interpret, which I think I have more of a grasp on it now. Many are called, but only few are chosen.
What verse is that?
Oh, it's in the gospel. I can't quote you the chapter and verse.
I'll look it up while you're explaining the distinction.
Okay. I'm not even sure that we need a distinction. I think just the mere hearing of the words lets us know and ask ourselves the question, am I called or am I chosen? Which do I want to be? Do I want to be with the many and be the called? Or do I want to be with the chosen and be the few? And I think that's the question that we have. That's more of an existential question that does not have an answer, let's say. But let's say they are categories. Maybe it is those who are called are those who hear the word of God as like the seeds. The seeds go out, and the ones that immediately hear the word of God begin to grow. What may happen to them is that temptation may come in and steal away the seeds before they get a foothold, or they may be scorched by the sun. The challenges of life may be too much for them. So I tend to see those as the called. The chosen are those who get beyond that, who seek something deeper, not just their own salvation. It's not, I tend to think people who just want to be saved are like, say, just save my skin and that's all I want. Rather than, what can I do for you now, Lord? How can I serve you? How can I repay you, if it's even possible, for my salvation? That, I think, is a sign that we're chosen. So the question would be, the existential would be to ask people, do you want to be just called, or do you want to be called and chosen? And so that's what did you find the chapter and verse on that?
Yeah, it's Matthew 22:14, and I'm trying to quickly surmise it's within in the nature of parable. There's something about a wedding.
Yeah, he says it in several places too, and it's never really completely clear what he's talking about there, how he relates it to the faith, and even Paul doesn't necessarily relate it. So I'm giving it a shot here. Hopefully, I've come close to it.
It's just very. I mean, I'm not saying it's just very interesting to think about that there would be individuals who would, with 100% authenticity, say, "I am Christian," and then be saved. But we'll address that further.
Yeah, for somebody to say, "I just want to be called, I don't want to be chosen," I can't imagine them being a bona fide Christian. But it's not up to me; it's up to God.
Right.
Okay.
It is.
So he goes on to say that to reach those in Christendom, you cannot use a direct or a straightforward method, but you have to use an indirect method. The reason is because they're living under an illusion. So those people that maybe you talked about there with the light show and that, they may be living in an illusion of one kind or another. What is the illusion? Does he believe that they're not really Christians? In my own notes, I even asked that question. This might be true, but I think that it's more that they're not mature Christians. Many of them, including pastors, remained in childish or make-believe thinking about Christ. Perhaps even their faith is make-believe. I'm sure that there are some who are baptized in Denmark and lived without confessing Christ would not be Christians. But I think his audience is wider than just those. So yes, I think he's speaking to a mixture in Christendom, a mixture of those who really are Christians but don't want anything to do with it, and those who are Christians and are more interested to say, where do I go from here? How do I become a better Christian?
Well, you know what's interesting is, earlier I alluded to that Kierkegaard wants this intensification of Christian religiousness, and he's not speaking about it so much from salvation terms on, the eternal perspective, that there might be reasons for this in terms of existential mood states. Mm-hmm. But if that's the case, Kierkegaard is a terrible representative of this whole idea, right? Because he's so incredibly melancholic, right? Because of the upbringing that he had. He's not exactly, I mean, really, as far as gloomy Danes go, I mean, it's like him and Hamlet are fighting for that number 1 and number 2 slot, right? Like they're both pretty miserable wretches. So I guess what I'm saying is that even a true assessment, what I said earlier? Or is Kierkegaard thinking more along the lines, like there's the passage in, I believe, is it in Revelation where Jesus says, "I don't want you lukewarm. I will spew the lukewarm out of my mouth," like that he's really trying to create.
Yes, he does. Those who are lukewarm, I'll spit you out of my mouth. I'll vomit you out of my mouth. Right, because he wants people.
So then that does bring in issues of salvation again.
Yeah, but it does. But again, we leave it to God, who spits out who he wants to spit out. We can only warn people. We can just warn people and give them the message. They have the responsibility. How the word works upon them is between them and the Holy Spirit.
Right.
So he says that he must begin as an aesthetic writer while truly being the religious writer, but appearing as the aesthetic writer. So he calls this incognito.
Right.
He admits that this indirect method might be a deceptive method, but it's justified in a special way. The aesthetic work is a deception, and this is the deeper reason for the pseudonyms. So he admits that he's being slightly deceptive in what he's saying here in order to get people to listen to him. But what if he's trying to deceive others into truth, like Socrates, his beloved philosopher? I'm not sure, Luke, if I would agree with this philosophy in deceiving one into the truth, which is somewhat putting it in a little more curt, but he's really deceiving people into the truth. So I'm not really sure at this point, as I was reading, whether I would agree that it's it's okay to do that. Is it okay to tell a lie if you're going to bring a person into Christ? I don't see that I don't want to say possible, but I say I don't see myself as ever doing that because I hold to the truth so much. I don't want to enter into lies because then I think I damage the whole gospel. But what do you think?
I certainly can't do it. I don't know how to lie. In fact, I see the utility in what Kierkegaard's saying because
Yes.
Bob and I were having a conversation off camera earlier, and I was just like, oh man, like I wish all my life someone had just presented evidence to me and given me proofs and da 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 da. And so I think about that in terms of how I go out into the world, and I try to demonstrate things to people because that's what I wanted my entire life. I didn't need any deception. I was beset with deception all over the place. I wanted some truth, and that's why I ended up studying philosophy. And well, then I found that form of truth, didn't really get the job done. Mm-hmm. I think the interesting question to ask here is Kierkegaard lying? Is he lying?
I don't think he is. I don't think he's lying. Being deceptive is a form of a lie, you might say. Maybe he's not verbally lying, but it's presenting something that really isn't true. However, I don't think he brings it to that point. But I just want to make it clear in case somebody says, well, if Kierkegaard could do it, I can do it too. Because I'll tell you what, I think
like when an author writes like Sartre, when he wrote No Exit, was Sartre lying?
No, because he made it obvious that this was a story. Let me give you an example. I've heard many pastors tell stories from the pulpit that weren't true. And they never told the people they weren't true. They made the congregation believe that these are beautiful stories that happened, but they never really happened. They're fictional. Yeah. But they motivated people to believe or to give more money or to do whatever, but they weren't true.
I can't do that, no.
So, yeah, you see, and that this is kind of an illusion that was he low? It may not be at that bright line, where you can say this is a lie, this is a truth. But he's certainly on the edge of lying when you deceive people and you know that they're accepting this story as true when it isn't true.
But come on, if you have two brain cells, there's like a willful suspension of disbelief, right? Like when you read The Seducer's Diary, you know it's not real. Like you kind of get lost in it, right? It's like when you go, like it's like when I went and saw like a community performance of Mary Poppins, right?
Yeah.
Like, there were all sorts of set malfunctions and bad props and bad makeup because they don't have any budget or whatever. But I willfully suspend my discernment of those things so I can enjoy it. You know what I'm saying? Like, and so if you have like two brain cells, you're just like, I'm going to dial down the rational scrutiny and open up my imagination so I can enjoy this aesthetic work, whether it be Mary Poppins or The Seducer's Diary. But at the end of the day, I'm a grown up and I know that Mary Poppins is just it's just a story, and that this thing that I just read wasn't autobiography. So I don't think he's a liar, and I don't know. I think he just I think he presumes that the reader will willfully engage in the suspension of disbelief, like we do when we go to the movies or something. Like I don't think Transformers is real. Actually, I think it's kind of real, but I used to not think it was real.
Yeah. Well, Hika, let's continue on here and let's see what he has to say about this.
All right.
Now that I built up the suspense, let's see if I can give you a conclusion. He's now trying to bring one into the truth, out from the illusion. if he isn't in an illusion, you must first remove the illusion, for it stands in the way of truth. So this is how he looked at what he was doing. He was trying to bring the person out from an illusion. And in order to do that, he had to use that deception. But what does he mean by deception? So let's look at page 40, the bottom of page 40. What then does it mean to deceive? It means that one does not begin directly with the matter one wants to communicate, but begins by accepting other man's illusion as good money. So, to stick to the theme with which this work especially deals, one does not begin thus, colon, I am a Christian, you are not a Christian. Not does one begin thus, colon, it is Christianity I am proclaiming, and you are living in a purely aesthetic category. No, one begins this way. Let us talk about aesthetics. The deception consists in the fact that one talks thus merely to get to the religious theme, but on our assumption, the other man is under the illusion that the aesthetic is Christianity, for he thinks, I am a Christian, and yet he lives in aesthetic categories. So trying to summarize that, what he's saying is that if he's speaking to somebody who can only see things in an aesthetic manner, to jump in and start saying, well, I'm a Christian and you're not because you're in the aesthetic world, he says, you're not going to get anything that way. So he says, what you do is you kind of level down with them. You come in and you present yourself as an aesthetic. And then when you win their confidence that you're not judging them, then you can bring them up to a higher level. So that's how he uses the illusion along with deception. Whether or not we consider that to be, valid or not, at least this is how he's looking at it. So we have to begin where someone is. We must see life from the point of view, from this point of view, or from their point of view, actually, in order to help them. Now, I don't know, have you ever studied psychology? You must have studied some psychology, right?
Stay a little of everything, Bob.
I'm sure you did, because you're a man of letters, a man of many letters. So, but this is book that I read that I thought was extremely interesting. It's called Existential Psychotherapy, and it was written by a Dr. Irvin Yalom, Y-A-L-O-M. If you're interested in existentialism and psychotherapy, he gives us he merges the two together very well. And judging from his name, he's a Jewish man. He's not a Christian man. So there's not a lot of Christianity here, but it gives you psychotherapy, which is extremely important. I think that psychology is so important for anybody who's a Christian teacher to understand. To try to understand how the mind functions is extremely important for anybody who's a teacher. So I just thought it was something I went into for a while to try to get a grasp of my own insanity as well as everybody else's.
While we're on the topic of that, for anyone who's interested, there is actually, I believe, an 11 or 12-part audiobook on YouTube for Carl Jung's Man and His Symbols that I just recently finished. And I found that to be very helpful on a number of levels as well, especially in understanding culture and religion and addressing modern psychotherapy movements. So I just throw that into the mix. It's a free resource out there that I think everyone should be familiar with Carl Jung, and it's brilliant. It's out there. It's free. You should go check it out. Okay.
If we were to begin by, well, let's see. I think I already did that. Okay, let me read this again because it's important. If we were to begin by saying that I'm a Christian and you're not, and that you're deceiving yourself into thinking you're a Christian, this would not work in pragmatics, but would rather polarize the other person against your ideas and against your arguments. To say I'm on one side of the line and you're not is automatically to polarize. And I've run into this in the world where I tell others that when I say to people I'm a Christian, and they respond by saying, well, yeah, I'm a Christian too. Yet I see in the way they're behaving and what they're doing, and sometimes what's on their Facebook pages, and realize.
Are you talking about me?
No, no, not this time, Luke, but that they're living in an aesthetic world, an aesthetic life, and not in the life of truth and humility. And if I were to challenge them, however, right off, they'd push back and accuse me of judging them.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, you'll get that a lot.
Yeah. He says that. Okay,
here's my impersonation of whenever that happens to me. I just feel so judged. So judged.
Yes. Well, I try to avoid putting people in that position. And I think that's what Kierkegaard did too. He says that he's convinced that Socrates was a Christian, even though Christ existed after him. Then I'm not sure whether I agree with him personally. I'm not sure that we can put Socrates in that category. I'm not saying I won't put him in the category.
He said that he became a Christian, not that he was.
He became a Christian.
Became a Christian. And I think I like that idea. You know why I like this idea? Is because I like the way it's almost like Kierkegaard is advocating this idea that God used Socrates to level the intellectual playing field, that like God introduced Socrates into history so that Socrates would go around and deflate all these pagan conceptions of God and justice and everything else, and then there would be nothing remaining, and then bam, here comes Christ.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, I like to think about it. I mean, I could be wrong and I could be putting words into Kierkegaard's mouth, but it's like God is using certain individuals in order to bring about the fulfillment of prophecy. And they don't necessarily have to be Christians or Jews themselves.
Well,
and also I like this idea that Socrates was given a chance to accept Jesus in Abraham's bosom or wherever he would have gone. If he would, you know, I don't know if he would have gone to Abraham's bosom. I know that Old Testament saints went there, but you know, I like the idea that Socrates or maybe some kid who grows up in Laos who's never heard of Jesus Christ has a chance.
Mm-hmm. Well, judging from the church fathers, many of them were more Socratic in their thinking.
Yeah, well, that was a big issue early on in the church, is they had to figure out how much of Neoplatonism and Gnosticism were going to be a part of Christian doctrine. It took a while for them to sort that out.
Yeah, there was a merging of philosophy and Christianity. The end result was I'm not sure how to even define it, but it was a what could we call it? What could we call the merging? Luke, you're a man of good words.
Well, I use the word syncretization, but
that would be a good word for it.
Yeah, but you know, what was I going to say?
A hybrid. I think I was thinking more of a hybrid where it wasn't really purely Christian and it wasn't really purely philosophy. It was a blending of the two that I'm not so sure did either one a favor. I think it reduced both of them. It was trying to compromise Christianity to make Christianity more believable, which actually Karl Barth had this theory that Christianity always follows philosophy. It always is looking for philosophy to bless it. And so it's always trying to live up to philosophy, use philosophical terms to define itself so that it would be accepted by the world of philosophy. I agree with him on that. Would you say that?
Well, it does that, but it does it at its own peril, because then you get hitched. You're unequally yoked. Then you've got Christian doctrine married to these secular ideas about the universe, and whenever that trade-off is made, it's a short-term advance. Yeah, you might gain some converts, but in the long run, the implications are absolutely crazy.
They are.
And you know, and I experience this a lot, because and I'm not going to go into it here because I'm not interested in risking my credibility at this point. But I think it is very important to remember the phrase that Pascal had sewed into his jacket. That the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Joseph is not the God of the philosophers. And like all my life, I was using philosophy to try to get to Jesus.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work. It doesn't work because man's secular philosophy will lead you committed to certain doctrines that you cannot integrate with Christianity.
No.
You might be able to rationally get to the plausibility of God, but you will never rationally prove through philosophy or science Jesus Christ.
And that's what this whole thing about Kierkegaard's leap is about. It's a leap of faith. There's no bridge that you can get from here to there. Philosophy is not the bridge that gets us from here to there.
And Kierkegaard knew this.
And he knew that.
And he knew it. You know, a lot of people were really excited about Hegelianism. They're like, "Oh, Hegel's going to do it for us. Hegel's going to get us to Christ. You know, Hegel's going to comprehend the totality of every thought every man ever thought. You know, and he's going to be, and like God is just going to come through Hegel and tell us everything."
Well, Hegel, he instead of a bridge, he built a Tower of Babel because
he's indecipherable.
Yeah. So now we enter into another one of his works called the Postscript. So he continues on. So this presents the problem of becoming a Christian. This is why he created synonymous authors, he says, to help a person to become a Christian by luring them away from the aesthetic life. So can we speculate about the many things such as I have now like flying saucers and alien beings, and I'm sure you can fill in the blanks with other things that we speculate.
I can talk about all that stuff at length.
I know, but this can lead to speculation about Christ.
I just want to direct people to Ezekiel's wheel.
Okay.
But also, I want to say I don't believe in aliens.
Okay. But this kind of thinking, this kind of speculation can create speculation about Christ as well. Because speculation is almost like a way of life, and it never ends. He advises us to take our mind out of these things. It's not through speculation that we can come to truth. It's through self-reflection. So we need to turn our efforts inwards to examine ourselves. And this was spoke really loudly to me because this is what I did through my life, is that everything external became a failure and never failed to get me from here to there. So that's when I started to look inward. And I realized the one most important thing that I could say about self-reflection is that truth begins with ourself. We have to first see who we truly are in order to be able to listen, in order to be able to understand the truth outside. If we can't accept the truth of who we really are, then we can't accept truth anywhere. And that truth doesn't come merely by self-reflection, but comes from God's illumination and self-reflection. The two must happen together because we can't find truth in ourselves. All we can find in ourselves is that speculation and failure to find the truth. And thanks to God's illumination of what is truth, that he is truth, that's what brings us to that point of Christianity, that point of exception. So through self-reflection, we don't find a truth, but what we do find is the lack of it, which in itself is a truth, paradoxically.
Right. But hey, I'll say this. For a long time, I understood that I didn't have all the answers, right? Mm-hmm. But so I knew for a long time that I was in untruth about the objective truth. Okay. Yeah. But I don't think I understood just how I don't think I understood just how sinful I was. I was like, you know, a pretty good person. I I don't think I understood how far away I was from God's holiness. So, you know, I think the illumination, if God does choose us in that way, to reference the Matthew 22:14, I think nearly every human can go, oh, I don't have the truth. You know, like I think any, you know, honest person can say that, and that they don't know God. But I think when God really chooses you, it's got to be in this place of it's weird. It's almost like you have to really be brought to your knees. You have to be brought to your knees, and like that, just know that you're just utter filthiness, you know.
Yeah. Well,
it's not even that like you're pretty good and like you kind of know some stuff. It's like I know nothing and everything I do is wrong. And that's like that's not like a great that's not like a great PR campaign for Christianity, but I think that's kind of how it works. At least that's kind of how it worked for me. Like I was shown this year, just, man, how far away I was from understanding the true nature of reality and God's perfection. I'm very,
Okay, I can't give you chapter and verse. I think it's around chapter 5 or 6 in Matthew. But Jesus says the eye is the light of the body. But if the light of the body is darkness, how great is that darkness? So this idea that if what we see, if we can't see anything, we're living in darkness, and what we see is darkness. And if that's the light of the body, how great is that darkness? That's why we need the illumination of God.
It's like I had spiritual cataracts, and then God did like divine LASIK on me.
Yeah.
Okay. You know what I'm saying? Like
putting it in modern terms, yeah. So one must reflect upon themselves in a different way than we are currently doing. So what does this mean to us today, Luke? Now I'm going to do this point here, and then when we get a little further, I'm almost reaching the end of today's little episode here, but I wanted to get through this. So what does this mean to us today? How do we update Kierkegaard's idea? Is there an aesthetic part of the church that we might call Christendom today? And how do we identify it? So what are some of the aesthetic things about the church? By aesthetic, and I should say this again, we're talking about the sensual things. Does the church have a sensual part that has this kind of alluring phase of it, that kind of just draws us into it, this sensuality of the church? Can you tell me some things that might be in the church today?
Well, I mean, today, I think last week I sort of mentioned it with the contemporization of the church through the spectacle of rock bands, but and then I mentioned maybe the blues music of snake handling Appalachian churches and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But specifically right now, because we're coming up on Christmas, Christmas trees.
The whole season.
The whole season, the church that I grew up in, like they decorate a Christmas tree, and it's a big fun thing for everyone. But it's pretty explicit in Jeremiah that we're not supposed to do that.
Mm-hmm.
That we're supposed to not be bringing trees into the worship thing. This is pretty obviously a pagan thing that ought not to be there. And they go out and they sing Christmas carols, and maybe they'll sing Away in the Manger, and then they'll sing Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer.
And how about if the pastor dresses up as Santa Claus and gives his sermon dressed up as Santa Claus?
You mean Satan Claus? You mean the guy dressed in red that we tell all the children about, and then they grow up and they're like, oh yeah, that was just a fairy tale, but Jesus is real. Don't doubt Jesus. Oh, that doesn't mess with a young person's mind at all. They don't
Not at
go,
all.
oh, well, Jesus. They're like, when I grew up, we did Easter egg hunts in the church, and we talked about getting gifts from Santa, and we talked about Jesus. And then I became 18 years old, and I was like, well, the Easter Bunny was a fairy tale, Santa was a fairy tale, but Jesus is real. Nah, he was probably a fairy tale too. I'm an agnostic now. Like,
yeah, I think that we've done a lot of damage, but that's my opinion. Apparently, your opinion as well. But now the harder thing is, Luke, how do we, if we look at the aesthetic church, and we could go on and on and on about the aesthetic, and it's what pleases us, what makes us enjoy kind of the pleasure of going to church and so forth. Not even just going to church, but other things as well. But what is a religious church then? If we now identify the aesthetic church, and we want to change the aesthetic church into religious church, how do we define the religious church? What kind of words would you use?
My opinion and your opinion, and we should just take it over and run it our way.
Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm sorry. Can you ask the question again? I felt like you set me up for a joke.
No, actually, you kind of drew me into that. I thought. Okay, so if we're looking at the religious church, and we are making a comparison between the aesthetic church and a religious church, and now we know what the aesthetic church is. What is a religious church? Is it just removing the things of the aesthetic church? As though when we remove things, we'll be left with the true church?
No, you could still have some, we could take away the rock band, we could take away the Christmas tree, and if you still have like a preacher up there who's like aesthetically sermonizing, right?
You mean performing?
Performing, yeah, these fake stories, right? Like, oh, I was sitting next to a woman at a bus stop, and I told her life was like a box of chocolates, and like, no, you didn't. That's a scene from Forrest Gump. That never happened to you. So if there's still lying going on in the pulpit, I don't know. I think about it a lot. I every day I try to listen to. There's this great channel on YouTube called Christian Audio Books and something. I can't. It's escaping me right now. But I've mentioned this before, but I try to listen to one of these Puritan sermons every day, and I'm like, oh man, the Puritans had it figured out, because they had Spurgeon and Octavius Winslow and A.W. Pink. You probably don't like. I don't know if you like that stuff. I like that stuff. So if I had a church, I'd have it like a Puritan church. I guess I'd be living in the Scarlet Letter standards. I'd go around putting A's on people. I'm crazy.
Okay,
no, I don't know. I like those sermons. I feel like those sermons I like those sermons. I feel like those sermons are totally legit. We don't necessarily have to wear pilgrim clothes, but I like those Puritan sermons.
I think it looked pretty cool in a pilgrim outfit, Luke, myself. I think
it's pretty cool hats. Pretty cool hats.
Oh, yeah, and the bib's cool. Okay, but the way I would define the religious church, I would say it's true holiness. It's our pursuit of true holiness would be the religious church. I think Kierkegaard would agree with me about that. I hope he would anyway. That what we're trying to do is take people from the superficiality of the church and bring them into the purest, holiest form of the church. And somehow somebody has to try to do that. And I can tell you from my personal experiences, it's not an easy bridge to lead people over from one side to the other. So how can
what do you think holy sermons look like? What because I'll like earlier I was just kind of like name dropping some individuals that like a Spurgeon, and
I do understand.
Like, who do you think does it right?
Well, I'm terrible with names. There are people, even some, I don't like to use the word televangelists, but there are some that are very good Maybe their names will come to me a little bit later.
That's
But
okay.
my way of looking at it would be, what would a sermon look like? It would be a sermon about Jesus. It would always focus about Jesus. Focusing on the Sermon on the Mount would be the epitome of the religious sermon. What religious sermon would best represent the religious stage or phase would be the Sermon on the Mount. And everything should take that sermon and just grow from that sermon, so that it could always point back to that sermon again, where everything helped an individual to come to a greater sense of holiness about God and a desire for holiness within themselves, not self-righteousness. Holiness is not self-righteousness. The way I explain it is that the vessels in the Old Testament, the vessels in the temple were made holy, which meant they were fit for use in the temple. They didn't have a self-righteousness, obviously, they're inanimate objects. But through the process of purification, the vessels became usable in the temple. We have to become cleansed so that we become usable in the temple. We have to look at ourselves that way. We have to be made holy. We have to want to be made holy. And that's the religious aspect. So we have those that are sitting enjoying their salvation, enjoying their blessings. There's nothing wrong with that, but who have no desire to go into the state of holiness. Okay, so that's how I would kind of define the two as to what was aesthetic and what was religious. So I will end there today. We're at page 44. The next one we'll do is a title called "The Difference in My Personal Mode of Existence Corresponding to the Essential Difference in the Works." And then we're going to go into how he actually lived his life and how he tried to almost mime or pantomime what he was doing as an author to live that life, making the transition from the aesthetic into the religious in his real life and into the community. So that'll be interesting next week.
Dope. Thank you, Bob. That was a riveting lesson as usual.
Thank you, Luke.
No one quite does it like you, my friend.
Thank you for the compliment. Appreciate it.
All right, everyone. I got to go back to being a CEO guy. So I got to figure out how to make the website and the app work better. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And
any questions? Yeah, if anybody has any comments or questions, just list them there on YouTube somewhere or on the app so that we can get a little feedback, help us know how we're doing and how to direct us.
You can email me at philosophyluke@gmail.com.
And you can email me at kingdomauthor@gmail.com.
Your email sounds a lot more regal than mine. I mean, it might need an email update.
Yeah, you're the boss, so you got to have a better one. It's not right that I have a better one than you.
My new email is going to be Dr. Philosopher CEO Luke @gmail.com.
Okay, there you go.
But for now, it's philosophyluke@gmail.com until I go through with such a narcissistic fantasy. All right. I'm going to edit this audio. It'll be up later tonight. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.